I can't believe how pathetic you are. I should have walked out on you years ago." Those were the words that slammed into me one chilly December night, a few weeks before my birthday. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I never thought my life could shatter so quickly under someone else's anger. You see, at one point, I believed I was the luckiest man in the world. I was married to a woman named Victoria, who seemed to be the perfect match for me. She was sharp, beautiful, and forever confident in the way she carried herself. But as those furious words echoed in my mind, I realized there was a storm in my marriage far bigger than I had ever let myself see. I was used to hearing small jabs from Victoria from time to time. Early in our marriage, she would tease me about how long it took me to get a promotion at work or poke fun at me for not knowing how to dress like a high-class professional. At first, I thought it was playful, that maybe she was just trying to motivate me or push me to be better. But over time, her words cut deeper. They felt more like criticisms than jokes, more like scorn than advice. Yet I clung to the memory of the sweet, caring woman I thought I'd married, hoping that her kindness would one day resurface. We were the kind of couple who looked perfect on social media. We had matching holiday sweaters in a dozen photos. We took vacations in tropical places, and we smiled wide for all the pictures we'd post. That's what people saw on their screens, two people who seemed so in love. My parents were thrilled when Victoria and I got engaged. My sister gushed about our pictures, claiming we were the model couple she wanted to emulate when she finally found the right man. But behind the posed photos and planned captions, I was always on edge. By the time my birthday was approaching, I was ready to admit that I was married to a complete stranger. Looking back, I can see 1,000 signs that something was very wrong. But at the time, I only felt small twinges of alarm. Victoria was masterful at dressing up her insults in humor. She'd say, "Oh, Dan, you look so adorable in that secondhand suit," then slip in that all her friends' husbands had custom-tailored outfits. She'd compliment me in one breath, then tear me down in the next. This seesaw of praise and shame kept me unsteady, sometimes believing she still cared. But gradually, I started to feel as though I was drowning in the weight of her criticism. About 2 weeks before my birthday, I found myself at the kitchen table, going over our bills. Victoria was in the living room, scrolling through social media on her phone, a glass of red wine half empty on the coffee table. She rarely helped with the finances, but always found a way to blame me if money got tight. As I worked through the numbers, I heard her laugh out loud at something, and she yelled across the room, "If you could hustle like my friends' husbands, maybe I wouldn't have to be so bored at home." It stung. My job was decent. I was a mid-level project manager at a construction firm that paid me enough for a comfortable life. I paid our mortgage, our utilities, and still managed to set aside a little for savings every month. We weren't rich, but we were far from poor. Yet to Victoria, anything short of extravagance felt like a failure on my part. I tried to swallow my pride, ignoring the jab, until she said that line about being pathetic. That one got under my skin like a splinter. I still remember my hand trembling as I closed my laptop. "Why would you say that to me?" I asked, standing up and walking toward her. She didn't even bother to look up from her phone. She just said, "Because you set the bar too low, Dan." Sometimes I think I settled. Those words became a crack in my heart that wouldn't close. I felt sadness, then anger, then shame. I tried my best to ignore that big, looming problem in our marriage for too long. Now I saw it in full view. Victoria was downright cruel to me. The next day, I remember driving to work and thinking about how my birthday was coming up. I wondered whether she'd planned something big, maybe a dinner with my family. She always liked to pretend she was the perfect wife around them. But a small, defeated voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe she'd skip the celebration altogether. All that changed when Victoria announced she wanted to host a party. Not a simple family get-together like I expected, but a huge event at an upscale restaurant, with fancy decor and a guest list that included her own friends, my closest family members, and quite a few people from my side of the family that I hadn't seen in a long time. She insisted on organizing it all herself. At first, I was touched by the gesture. A glimmer of hope sparked inside me. Maybe she was trying to turn a corner, to make amends for the hurt she'd caused with her words. I told myself maybe we were finally going back to the early days of our relationship, when she would do thoughtful things and make me feel important. But nothing prepared me for the humiliation she had waiting for me on that day. 2 days before my birthday, I came home from work to find Victoria bustling around the house, talking loudly on the phone with a friend. She was discussing table arrangements and color schemes, fancy place cards, and all kinds of details I'd never have expected for a simple birthday party. I walked over to her, trying to peek at her notes, but she guarded them with her arm. "Don't worry about any of this," she said, waving me away. "This is above your pay grade." Then she turned back to the phone conversation, ignoring me like I was an uninvited guest in my own house. I tried to brush it off again. Maybe, I reasoned, she was just stressed because she wanted the party to be perfect. I still held on to that thread of optimism, even if it was quickly unraveling. On the day of the party, I remember sitting in front of my dresser mirror, tying my necktie, and telling myself to do whatever it took to stay calm and positive. People would be there for me. My parents, my sister, my best friend from childhood, Paul. I had a few close buddies from college who were also coming into town. I wanted to enjoy seeing everyone. Maybe this was a sign that Victoria was turning a new leaf and wanting to celebrate me after all. So I put on the best suit I had, though not nearly as fashionable or expensive as she would have liked, paired it with a crisp shirt, and then took a deep breath before heading out the door with her. We arrived at the venue, a private room in an upscale restaurant. I was impressed by the decorations. Balloon arches, centerpieces bursting with flowers, small lights twinkling around each table. There were buffet stations with gourmet food, a tiered cake, and even a live band set up in the corner. It looked spectacular, and for a split second, I thought maybe she had indeed done something kind, just for me. I tried to thank her, but as soon as I opened my mouth, she cut me off. "Don't just stand there," she said. "Greet the guests. They're already waiting." Her tone was so cold, it was jarring. She was still wearing that lovely hostess smile for the other people who were coming in. But the warmth never reached her eyes when she looked at me. Still, I did what she said. I went around, shaking hands, hugging old friends, and telling everyone how glad I was to see them. My parents beamed with pride. My sister teased me that I'd better make a big speech later. My friend Paul slapped me on the back and told me it was about time I turned 35. It was all the usual stuff: laughter, small talk, polite conversation. Beneath that cheerful surface, though, I felt an uneasy tension. Whenever I looked at Victoria, I noticed her exchanging sly glances with a small group of her friends. They'd whisper, laugh under their breath, and look at me with what felt like pity in their eyes. Just as the dinner was winding down, the band stopped playing. The hush in the room signaled that something was about to happen. I figured maybe Victoria had planned a little birthday toast, or perhaps a slideshow of photos from my childhood. She'd been collecting pictures for weeks. Instead, she stood up in front of everyone, took the microphone, and cleared her throat. With a perfectly dramatic pause, she said, "I know you all came here tonight to celebrate Daniel, but there's something else I need to share. I can't keep pretending anymore." The room fell silent. My heart began to pound so loudly I could barely hear her words at first. Then she dropped her bombshell. "Daniel," she announced, gazing right at me with an expression that was part triumph, part scorn, "I want a divorce." For a moment, it felt like the world slowed to a crawl. I heard a confused murmur ripple through the crowd. My mother let out a gasp. My father tightened his arm around her shoulders. My sister's eyes went wide with shock. And me, I just stared back, stunned, struggling to process the fact that on my birthday, in front of all these people, my wife was not only humiliating me, but was actually proud of it. Everyone's eyes were on us, waiting for my response. My jaw clenched, and I struggled to find words. Before I could speak, she launched into an explanation of why she felt we had grown apart, how she felt we no longer shared the same dreams, how she felt I wasn't ambitious enough for her. She spoke like she'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. She even managed to throw in a self-congratulatory line about how she would be graceful through this process, but how it was time for her to live her truth. Then she turned to me and gave a theatrical sigh, as if she were the victim in all this. My mother started to get up, tears in her eyes, but my sister put a hand on her arm, telling her to wait. For a moment, the entire room was so silent that you could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner. Victoria's eyes scanned the crowd, savoring the attention. She looked like she was expecting me to beg for her to reconsider, or maybe to collapse into tears. But instead, I stayed calm. Slowly, I felt a strange clarity rise in my chest, almost like the quiet before a lightning strike. I stood up from my chair. My knees felt weak, but my voice came out steady. All right, I said softly. You want a divorce? We can talk about that. But first, there's something I'd like everyone to hear. I glanced toward the DJ booth, where I'd arranged for a specific audio track to be cued. I had planned on playing a nostalgic message from my parents about my childhood. But in the last 2 weeks, my life had taken such a strange turn that I ended up preparing something very different. A flicker of confusion crossed Victoria's face. Dan, what are you doing? She snapped, trying to maintain control of the moment. But she was too late. I gestured to the DJ, who nodded and pressed play. I had insisted on having a hidden microphone placed in our living room for a week. Ever since that night, she called me pathetic. I needed proof, some way to protect myself. I had no illusions that a recording alone would fix anything. But I wanted people to see that the kind, confident wife they thought they knew was someone else behind closed doors. The first words out of the speakers were Victoria's voice, dripping with condescension. He's so naive. He thinks I'm throwing him a birthday party out of love. Really, I just want an audience. I want him to see how many people will side with me when I announce I'm done. The hush of the audience transformed into shocked murmurs. A few glances darted toward Victoria, who stood there with her mouth open, eyes wide as if she were seeing a ghost. Then came more clips. Her talking on the phone with one of her friends. She mocked my financial struggles. He's always counting pennies. I can't stand his cheap gifts. Does he really think I'm impressed by a necklace from a department store? And then the final blow. I'm going to humiliate him in front of everyone, so maybe he'll realize what a loser he is. The room was thick with tension. My sister looked furious. My mother was trembling, tears in her eyes, now for a different reason. My father clenched his jaw so hard I thought he might break it. My friend stood in stunned silence. I saw a range of emotions, shock, pity, anger, etched on the faces of everyone there. Even the staff in the room had paused, looking on with wide eyes. When the recording ended, I stepped forward, my hands shaking at my sides, but my voice surprisingly steady. Victoria, I said, you brought everyone here to watch you humiliate me. You said it was time to live your truth. Well, I guess that's fair, because it's time for people to know the truth. I've been trying to make our marriage work for years, but your insults, your contempt, they've eaten away at me like acid. I hope tonight might be different. But now I see what you truly had in mind. She was frozen, her face drained of color. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, she erupted into loud, angry protests. That's not real. You're lying. You manipulated those recordings. She looked around at her friends, hoping for backup, but they stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of how to respond. My sister stepped forward and snapped, "How dare you do this to my brother? And on his birthday, of all times." My mother, regaining some composure, turned to me and asked quietly, "Is it true, Dan? Has she been talking like this for a while?" I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The weight of the entire evening threatened to crush me, but I forced myself to remain as calm as I could. I could feel my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I felt tears brimming in my eyes, but refused to let them fall. All eyes were back on Victoria, who was now shaking with rage. Her plan had backfired so spectacularly that she couldn't contain her fury. She tried to storm up to the speakers, maybe to yank out the cables, but my best friend Paul stepped in front of her, quietly but firmly blocking her path. That only made her angrier. She screamed something incoherent and shoved him aside, causing him to stumble into a table where a glass of wine toppled over. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I could see the waitstaff in the corner, unsure of whether to intervene or call security. With trembling hands, Victoria tore the microphone from its stand. Her voice blasted through the speakers, cracking with desperation and anger. "You people have no idea what I've had to deal with. Dan is the one who's worthless. He's, she struggled, searching for a cutting remark that would keep her power, but the mask she wore was gone. Everyone had heard her unfiltered words already. Her face was twisted in frustration, tears of rage wetting her cheeks. I watched her, remembering the first time I told her I loved her. I'd been so sure she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. She was wild, confident, someone who turned heads everywhere we went. Now she stood there, undone by the truth of her own cruelty. My stomach churned with both sorrow and a strange sense of liberation. The truth was finally out, in front of everyone. She let out a guttural cry, threw the microphone on the floor, and ran out of the room, tears streaming down her cheeks. A stunned silence followed, punctuated by the echo of the microphone's feedback. Nobody moved for a few seconds, as if we were all too shocked to process what had just happened. Then my sister stepped forward and hugged me, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Dan. I had no idea." My parents came over next. My father put a hand on my shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "Son, I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I hate what she did to you, but I'm proud you kept your dignity." The guests started to murmur among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to stay or leave. Others came up to me, offering kind words, apologies, or just supportive pats on the back. A few of Victoria's friends slipped out the door to find her, presumably. Even the waitstaff, who had been standing like statues, came up to me to ask if there was anything they could do. I felt numb. My birthday had turned into a public spectacle of pain, but overshadowing the humiliation was a strange sense of relief. I never asked for a divorce, but she had forced my hand. At least now, the truth was out in the open. I wasn't going to live another day pretending that things between us were fine. Paul handed me a glass of water and said quietly, "If you want to wrap up, we can." I nodded. There was no more celebration to be had. The evening had soured irreparably. But as the host of this gathering, albeit unwillingly, I needed to address the people who were still here, still waiting for guidance. I picked up the microphone from the floor, tested it to see if it was still working, and spoke. My voice trembled, but I managed to get the words out. "I'm sorry this night ended like this." It was supposed to be a celebration, and instead, it turned into something I never wanted or expected. I paused, my eyes drifting over the shocked faces of my family and friends. "Thank you all for coming. For those of you who want to stay, there's still food, and the band is paid for the night. But if you need to go, I understand." People started clapping softly, an awkward attempt at support. My mother and sister rushed up to me, hugging me tight. A wave of relief and sorrow washed over me, and I fought back tears. I noticed that the corner of the room where Victoria's circle of friends had been standing was now empty. They had likely gone out to comfort her, though I doubted they could. She'd shown her hand. Maybe she could spin a story about how I was the villain, but that recording was pretty damning. The rest of the night was surreal. Some guests left, still in shock. Others stayed, murmuring quietly and offering me gentle words of encouragement. Paul tried to lighten the mood by asking the band to play something upbeat, but nobody felt much like dancing. My mother asked me if I wanted to gather my things and head home, but the last place I wanted to be was in that house with Victoria. I knew I wasn't about to crawl into bed next to her tonight, or ever again. Eventually, I did leave, but not to go home. I went to my parents' place. That car ride was mostly silent, with my mother occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and my father keeping a stoic expression. My sister drove her own car behind us, wanting to make sure we were all together. I sat in the passenger seat of my parents' car, staring at the dark sky, wondering how things had unraveled so quickly. Yet, as painful as it was, I felt a strange sort of clarity that I'd never had before. The house of cards Victoria and I had built was tumbling down. Maybe it was a blessing in disguise to end it this way, rather than letting her torment continue in private. She wanted a divorce? So be it. I decided I'd grant her that, but not on her terms. If she wanted to humiliate me and come out on top, that plan had failed. And now I had a chance to stand up for myself in a way I'd never done before. The next morning, I woke up at my parents' house. My head pounded, and I felt groggy from lack of sleep. Even so, I got dressed, had a cup of coffee, and braced myself for the phone calls and texts that would inevitably start rolling in. By mid-morning, I was bombarded with messages from friends, co-workers, even acquaintances who'd heard about the fiasco. Everyone wanted to know what happened, if I was okay, what my side of the story was. Victoria called me too, several times, in fact, but I refused to answer. She left increasingly frantic voicemails. "Dan, you have to listen to me. My friends misunderstood. You manipulated me. You have to pick up." On, until the last one was just her sobbing and calling me cruel for airing our dirty laundry in front of everyone. The irony was almost too much to bear. I decided that before I said anything to her, I would reach out to a lawyer. My father recommended a good one, a friend of the family. We met that afternoon, and I laid out everything. The recordings, the public humiliation, the fact that we had some shared property and finances. She listened calmly, then said I had a strong position should Victoria try to take me to the cleaners. Frankly, all I wanted was a fair split. I had no appetite for revenge, despite everything. I just wanted to be free, to finally breathe without the constant drip of her insults. For the rest of the week, I avoided contact with Victoria. I stayed with my parents, ignoring her calls. Then, on Friday, I got a text from her. I'm going to move out tomorrow. The house is yours. I'll send for my things later. I'm sorry. It was short, to the point, devoid of the usual venom. Somehow, that made me feel sad. There was a part of me that had genuinely loved her once. But I knew any attempt to fix what was broken would only leave me in more pain. I drove over to the house, accompanied by my sister and Paul, in case Victoria tried any theatrics. To my surprise, she was already gone. The closet doors were flung open, and many of her clothes were missing. A couple of suitcases lay near the front door, half-packed, as though she'd left in a hurry. I walked from room to room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. This was the home we'd shared for several years, yet now it felt foreign. My sister helped me bag up the last items Victoria had left behind. I tried not to look at the framed photos on the shelves, the ones from our wedding day, from our early vacations. We'd looked so happy then, so hopeful. I took them down and placed them in a cardboard box. I planned to store them in the attic, at least for a while. As the divorce proceedings got underway, Victoria and I communicated mainly through lawyers. She tried to claim emotional damages from the night of the party, stating that I'd conspired to shame her in front of everyone. But my lawyer calmly pointed out that it was her who had made the humiliating public announcement, and all I had done was offer proof of her intentions. The judge, after hearing the evidence, dismissed her claims. It was more than a little satisfying to see her attempts at a vicious legal assault fall flat. Meanwhile, my family and friends rallied around me. My mother insisted that my father and sister come over to cook meals together and watch silly movies, trying to cheer me up. Paul came by almost daily to drag me out for a run or just sit with me in companionable silence. The support was overwhelming, and it reminded me that life had more love to offer than what I'd grown used to with Victoria. Weeks passed, and the divorce settlement was hashed out. I kept the house, partly because she didn't want it anymore. She wanted to move in with a friend in the city, which was fine by me. The financial split was reasonable. She got some savings we had set aside, and I retained my retirement fund. I could feel the tension leaving my body day by day, replaced by a cautious sense of hope for the future. But the real test came when a rumor started swirling that Victoria was trying to undermine my reputation at my workplace. Apparently, she'd told a few of my colleagues that I was emotionally unstable, that I'd lashed out at her in private. I felt the old anger and defensiveness rise in me when I heard that. Part of me wanted to confront her right away. Instead, I calmly went to my boss, explained the situation, and showed him the recording from the party. He listened with a grim face, then assured me that any rumors would be ignored. "Your work speaks for itself," he said. "We're behind you." The final hearing for our divorce came and went without any drama. The judge declared our marriage officially ended. As I walked out of the courthouse, I saw Victoria in the hallway, leaning against a wall, tears staining her cheeks. It was the first time I'd seen her in person since the night of my birthday. She looked smaller, somehow, defeated. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, remembering the good times we once shared. Part of me wanted to say something to her, to offer a kind word or a goodbye. But in the end, all I could manage was a polite nod as I passed by. The distance between us was more than physical. We were done. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I made changes to the house, repainting walls, rearranging furniture, making it feel more like my own space. I spent weekends visiting old friends, rekindling bonds I'd let slip during the stress of my marriage. My sister set me up on a few dates, though I wasn't sure I was ready to try romance again. Still, it felt good to spend time with people who genuinely liked me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit with a cup of tea and reflect on everything that happened. The day Victoria humiliated me was awful, but it was also the day I found out just how strong I could be. I realized that standing up for myself was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. Yes, it had hurt to air our private issues in front of everyone. But if she hadn't put me in that corner, I might never have found the courage to break free. Over time, word spread about what happened. A few neighbors tried to pry for details, and I gave them polite but vague answers. My mother, who initially wanted to defend me to the whole neighborhood, soon realized it wasn't worth it. People believed what they wanted, and those who mattered stood by my side anyway. I stopped replaying the recording in my mind, letting those angry words fade into the past. One late afternoon, about a year after the divorce, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Victoria. The envelope was plain, with just my name and address. I hesitated to open it, unsure of what she could possibly say after all this time. When I finally did, the letter read, "Dan, I guess I owe you a real apology. You may never forgive me, and I don't blame you. I've done a lot of soul searching. I lost myself in trying to be someone I'm not, someone who only cares about wealth, status, and appearances. I hurt you in ways I can't undo. You deserve better than that. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry for what I did on your birthday and in our marriage. I hope someday you can find peace and maybe, in time, forgive me. Victoria." I sat at my kitchen table, reading that letter over and over. It didn't absolve her of the pain she caused, but I felt a sense of closure. Maybe she had learned something from all this. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. I didn't feel the need to respond. I realized that forgiving her wasn't something that needed to be public or formal. Over the year, I had grown enough to let go of my anger. That night, I took one last walk through all the corners of the house, remembering the chaotic night when everything came undone. I thought about the guests crowding this very living room, the tension in the air as the recording played, the way she ran out in tears. My birthday had become a memory of heartbreak and revelation, but it had also marked a turning point, a day when I learned I had more self-worth than I had ever realized. Eventually, I turned off the lights and went upstairs to bed. I felt a sense of calm in the darkness of my room. The man who once cowered at his wife's belittling remarks was gone. In his place was someone who, while still healing, was at least free from the slow, corrosive drip of contempt. I closed my eyes and let sleep come, grateful that I had the strength to let the truth shine through when it mattered most. And I promised myself that from now on, I would never again allow anyone to break me down without a fight. That's how my marriage ended, right on the night meant to celebrate my life. But it wasn't the end of my story, only the beginning of a new one, where my dignity stood tall, even amid the wreckage of what might have been.